So I've had quite a few people tell me that I need to watch Jibaro, which is an episode of the latest season of Love, Death and Robots. It's from director Alberto Mielgo. And I even had somebody tell me that it reminded them a lot of me, which is questionable. Whether it left you feeling amazed or distinctly unsettled, or a mixture of both, like I felt, it's still a feast for your eyes and mind, and it's a masterpiece that will stay with you for a long time after you're done watching. I have seen a ton of people online arguing about whether this is really animation. Some people think it's live action with filters laid over it. Some people think it's rotoscoping. Some people think it definitely has to be motion capture. That's how realistic it looks. The level of detail in the textures, the lighting, the attention paid to the sound design, the animation itself, it's all impeccable. And it takes animation as a medium to a whole new level of realism, especially considering the fact that it is actually keyframe animated. It's not motion capture, it's not rotoscoping, it's literally keyframe animated. But before I go off on a tangent about the animation, which I will address later on in the video, I just want to focus on the texture a little bit for now, because that is something that stood out for me so head and shoulders above the rest of everything else. And for me, that's what made this have the impact that it had on people, was the sheer amount of texture and depth to every aspect of this episode. And I don't just mean the texture in terms of the texturing, like applied to the 3D models or the characters, although that was incredible in and of itself. I mean the level of texture in every aspect of this masterpiece, because that's what it is. It's incredible. It's a work of art. Every aspect of the short film had an incredible amount of attention and a level of detail and depth and texture to it. And that's within the sound design, the music, the lighting, the physics in the water, the animation itself, and of course the actual texturing. Everything was so rich in what it was. There was so much depth. There were so many levels to every little aspect of this episode. It was almost like a little bit of a sensory overload. I don't know if you've ever gone out into like a forest or something, but that's sometimes how you feel, because when you go into a place where like humans don't usually go, the sounds and the texture and everything untouched by humans, nature's just going balls to the wall because nobody's been there to sort of disrupt them from it. It's very noisy. There's a lot going on. And you really get that effect from this episode. Visually, there are some parts that you see more crisply than others. They're sharper, more detailed, brighter, more saturated, like the brocade and embroidery on the cloth, or these little colorful details in the forest, which is a really interesting treatment. Something else that I found really interesting is that some parts of the environment were actually 2D painted backgrounds, like the forest around the lake at some points, that they just wrapped around the lake. If you look closely at the textures on the characters, you'll see there's quite a painterly effect in the variations in tones and textures. Like if you pause it on one of these frames, it looks like a painting or an illustration, which works well with all the details surrounding them in the environment. And it does sort of help the film to not stray too far into the uncanny valley, but I do feel like there's still a little bit of that discomfort, particularly with the facial animation. It's a little wooden at times for me. It's possibly because when we watch something animated, we're used to a certain level of exaggeration to bring more life to a character, because it's not a living human. Our brains know that. It is a lifeless puppet being manipulated by a human. So to convince our brains that it's alive and human, we need to exaggerate certain things. And because the characters here were animated so closely to the actors that were filmed as the reference, it kind of felt like the expressions were a little bit stiff at times because they lacked that exaggeration. The animation feels so real because it was based very closely on real movements and choreography, but it wasn't motion capture. The director has confirmed this. It was keyframe animation. You know, you should always use reference and footage when you're animating, but here they had a whole troupe of dancers acting out and dancing each specific shot exactly the way it would be animated, which is why the movements do look so real. The use of choreography and dance to communicate, rather than any words ever being spoken, creates an incredibly expressive visual language. And it's so amazing to see this kind of communication come across so successfully and rivetingly in animation. Because yeah, we've seen it in live action dance or like on a stage or something with real people, but to translate it so successfully into animation is an incredible feat. Obviously, the movements of the siren stole the show. She was so supple and smooth and bendy, but not in an unrealistic way. Like if you've watched professional dancers or contortionists, bodies can move in that way. It's just not typical. And it was fantastically animated. But I also really particularly love the scene where the knights have been hypnotized and they're all dancing and leaping to their deaths. It's such an interesting juxtaposition to have these brutal knights in armor. You know, figures that you wouldn't typically expect to be dancing and moving in such agile and flexible ways, especially when they're dancing to their deaths. And there's something so macabre about that because dancing is usually associated with joy, you know? So that scene was pretty haunting and it had a great impact. Another incredible scene, I mean, they all were, but I can't analyze the whole 15 minutes, so I have to pick a small part, was this one. I found this really interesting to look at for the animation details because it's such a puzzling and emotional scene. It really communicates a lot. I think it kind of represents that fascination with another person, even when you know they're dangerous and bad for you, and that codependence, that wanting to be near them even though you know that they're toxic. You almost can't help yourself, you've got to be near them. And the staging, the direction, the animation, the way they've conveyed that so clearly here is brilliant to me. There's an establishing shot that sets the time in context. Here we see it's dusk, because the sky is not fully dark. The sun's still setting there behind the mountains, so we have that context for this scene. It's setting the time for us. We're coming from a low angle looking up at the night sky, and this is sort of from the angle that the knight would be at on the ground. In the next shot, the siren emerges from the water. At first, just the top of her head and her shoulder are peeking out for some anticipation. You almost don't know what creature is there at first. And then her head leads, but quite soon after that comes her hand and her arm. And that pose is quite unnatural. It's unexpected for somebody coming out of the water, so it's quite eerie how her arms are back like that. She swings the one arm forward in a really nice, strong arc. And then the next arm does the same motion after that, sweeping across the water. And then she comes up and arches her body in a really nice S-curve. And while her jewelry and all these beads are flying around her body, giving really nice texture and follow through on every motion she does, they do sort of obscure her body, but you can still see nicely those curves of her silhouette. Amazing physics on that water simulation, the way it reacts to her movements, and you get the splashes and the bit of foaming and small bubbles there and the ripples. The camera adjusting focus as she comes out of the water and finding a new subject to focus on as she emerges, and that focus shift, just like when you're filming in real life, also gives the scene more realism. And the way the lighting is deliberately overexposed, brightly lit as if there's a spotlight on her to film this at night, as if it was really filmed and not animated. You've got these really hot spots on her, which are deliberate flaws that add to that realism. A lot of the time, that's where people go wrong when they're trying to animate something to look realistic. They don't account for the flaws you get when filming. And the animation and camera works end up being too perfect. It detracts from the realistic feel because when you're filming something live action, you don't have complete control over everything like you do with animation. You've also got the little bugs flying around. It's just like when you try filming something at night. If you look closely though, you can see the foliage, the blades of grass and the leaves here in the foreground, as well as the leaves on the tree in the background, are actually not very detailed. And that allows us to focus on her, because she's carrying all the detail on her costume. This cut to the night sleeping establishes that this is where she's heading. This is her goal, and the staging and composition of the shot leaves him looking pretty vulnerable. He's sleeping under some pretty spindly, weak-ass looking trees that don't provide much shelter or protection. There are no bushes or anything around him to give him some coverage or to fill the scene with comforting mass. It's pretty barren, and he's just there in the open for anyone to sneak up and attack him. So it seems kind of menacing that she's creeping out of the water now towards him. Right now, we don't know what the deal is, if she's going to kill him in his sleep or what. This handheld tracking in of the camera, so quick and chaotic, is quite a contrast to the fairly peaceful, subtle dolly in of the camera in the previous shot. So it's a bit of a surprise and sort of contributes to the unsettling and menacing feel of the scene. She seems unhinged, obviously, and this chaotic camera work confirms it. It may also be her panic and anxiety. She knows that this guy, if he wakes up, can kill her, but she's drawn to him. He's different from the other men she's known. Her magic didn't affect him, so she's completely fascinated, but they're dangerous to each other. He's vulnerable because he's sleeping, so she could hurt him, but also he's very dangerous to her if he does wake up. She peeks out sort of coyly from behind the tree, which gives us some anticipation there, and there's that really nice follow through on the beads that she wears. They're always giving motion to her body, and every move she makes has this chaotic flair because of them. Then she moves back behind the tree for a second and then pushes herself out from it, and watch how her body curve inverts as her weight changes and she pivots on her foot, then throws her head back. Her eyes are fixed at a point just above into the corner of the camera, which is pretty disconcerting. It's almost as if she's looking at the light source or whoever's behind the camera. Whatever she's looking at, it adds another layer to the eerie discomfort because she's not looking at anything we know about. She's not looking at the knight because he's asleep on the ground. So subconsciously, we wonder what she is looking at, like what do we not know? And her eyes stay fixed there as her body keeps turning until they can't physically stay fixed there anymore as she turns. And all these beads looping and arcing out around her make her feel like an uncontrollable, chaotic and destructive force as she spins, almost like a hurricane. In the next shot, it's a closer shot of the knight sleeping, but our focus here is on the blanket being pulled off of him by the siren siren off screen. He's already vulnerable, and she's removing this cover, almost stripping him symbolically. He feels even more vulnerable now, and by having her off screen and the blanket just coming off like that, almost as if it could have happened by itself, gives it a much more eerie feeling. The cloth looks great as it slides over his armor, and you've got the tassels there flipping up with some follow through as well as they bounce over him. In the next cut, we have a wide angle of the two of them, her standing above him and in motion to sit down. She does a great move with a beautiful arc to her leg and that S-curve in her posture, and then she sits down really suddenly and with her back straight and looks towards the camera. Then we cut to a close-up of just her, and again she's looking at someplace just above the camera. The handheld effect of the camera work makes it feel almost as if we were there, as if we're holding the camera. If someone's looking towards you, you expect them to meet your eyes at some point, but she keeps looking towards the camera but not directly at it, which can be unsettling. She licks the air. I don't know, maybe she's like a snake or something and she's tasting the air. Tasting is smell, that's what it looks like. But you can see the nice arc there in her head motion, and the anticipation of her eyes moving down to look at him a few frames before her head follows. And then she moves sideways closer to his head in another nice smooth arc. This is a great short film to study arcs in, actually. All her moves and any dancer's moves really, if you look at them, showcase such beautiful, fluid, strong arcs. Then she turns her head and her head leads the next action. So we've got that change of direction and the overlapping action on the rest of her body as it follows her head. And again, the change in direction as she arcs closer to him again. And then we cut in tighter on both of them. They're using the rule of thirds here for the framing. Her face in the top third and his in the bottom. He's asleep and totally unaware, and she's completely alert, and for once she's looking directly at the camera, which gives this particular shot some impact or significance because that hasn't been the norm till now. You see as she leans on him and her body weight presses down on him, we've got that compacting and response in his body, and his head as well as that weight presses down on him. Then we cut back to her arcing up again, and check out the timing and spacing here. Fast as she pushes up, slows down at the apex quite a lot, and then as her head changes direction to go back down, it's slow, then builds up momentum quite quick as she moves back down behind him. Then we cut to this overhead shot of the two of them, and this red blanket that she pulled off him is very portentous. It's sort of an omen of what's gonna happen. That crushed red velvet in this high contrast lighting looks very much like a big pool of blood. She writhes and moves on the floor, and you see her spine in a C-curve here, and then it inverts so fluidly as she curls around him. And we've got that secondary action of his body responding to her weight again as she throws her leg over him quite possessively. She comes up again, all sinuous and arcing in her motions, and then ducks down behind him again. The next shot is showing us that it's now dawn. So this shot is giving us that context of that passage of time, because if you remember in the beginning of this, we saw a shot where it was showing us that it was dusk. So now it's dawn, a whole night has passed. We're sort of wondering if it's morning now, what are we going to see? What did she do to him, or what's his reaction going to be when he wakes up and sees her there? We cut to him, we see his eyebrows start to twitch, and then his body responds as he starts to gain consciousness. Do you notice how he doesn't just open his eyes and he's awake straight away? There are all these tiny, subtle indications of consciousness coming back to him slowly before he opens his eyes. Secondary action in twitching in the brows, the head moving slightly, the shoulders and body moving, and then his eyes open slightly, and we see his pupil moving there. And then he blinks and looks up, starts to remember what happened the day before, and looks at the scale that he's holding in his hand that he picked up at the lake. The one that actually alerted the siren to the knight's presence. He looks at it, and you can see there's some really nice movement in his fingers there as he really examines it and moves around in his fingers. And then he rolls over a little to look up at the trees. We cut to a wider shot and we see her arm over him, but he hasn't realized she's there yet. He can't feel it because the weight of his armor prevents him from feeling the weight of her arm, and he's still regaining consciousness. He's still getting his bearings back. So he rolls over and looks up, and we cut to his point of view, which is a worm's eye view of the trees above him, and then back to the shot of him lying there with her arm over him. And this is when he starts to realize she's there. He first looks down at her arm around his waist, and that's a quick movement of shock, which is a contrast to the slow, lethargic movements previously of him waking up. You also see his breathing start to speed up as his heart rate increases as he realizes he's not alone. He first looks down at her arm in a quick movement, and then a follow-on on that movement. He turns and tries to look behind him, which is obviously difficult with his armor on. The next shot is an upside-down view of a very close shot of his face, giving us an insight into his confusion. This off-kilter kind of angle gives an element of confusion to us as well, letting us feel a bit of what he feels. Just a whole bunch of what the f***ery. There's another top down so we can see that she's asleep now, or at least not fully aware that he's woken up. And you can see by how slack her body is and how the only movements are the follow through on her body responding to his movements. And then the next few shots are quite quick cuts between extreme close-ups of their bodies and faces. There's the shot as he sees a part of her. We're seeing what he sees and he can't quite turn to look at her face fully. We see his face again as he processes what it is he's seeing, because that was quite an abstract view that he had there. He obviously remembers the jewels he was coveting, Then we see her sleeping face, or at least the closed eyes behind the mask, and the jewels and beads that she's wearing, all moving with his motions as he moves. She's still asleep. Then we cut to a view of his face looking over his shoulder, as if from her perspective, as she's now waking up. As we see in the next shot, she wakes up slowly, and then as she realizes, she moves her head back sharply in a really quick recoil. And you see those eye dots as she opens her eyes, and her eyes find something to focus on when she first opens them. And then another dot when she focuses on his face and realizes he's awake, and she pulls back. In the next cut, that movement follows on, and both of them sit up really quickly as they're on the defensive now, ready for an attack from the other person. This episode of Love, Death and Robots was an astounding work of art, and while it's definitely not a feel-good short film, it's something that will amaze you and it will stay with you for a long time after you're done watching. I have to say, I didn't get bored even once, and I literally have the attention span of a toddler, so that's saying a lot. While it was completely riveting and truly a sight to behold, it did feel sort of video gamey to me at points, and while obviously there would be a dope-ass video game to play, it wasn't a video game. So at times I did feel kind of taken out of that immersion. I was still very interested. I didn't lose interest in what was happening, but the believability of it at times, I was taken out of it a little bit because it did feel like a video game. But nonetheless, that's like a tiny, tiny little issue that I had with it. It was an absolutely incredible and breathtaking work of art. Thank you to my amazing patrons. I appreciate every single one of you. I appreciate the support. If you didn't know, I do have a Patreon page. You can go check it out if you want to support the channel. Otherwise, hit the like button. It does help with the algorithm. And subscribe to keep up with the rest of my videos. Thanks for watching, guys. Love ya. Bye.